Alrighty. So last class we talked about the sort of ideas of intuition versus deliberation as a framework for decision making, and we were sort of thinking there's lots of different ways in which intuition versus deliberation have been described. What we were focusing on was intuition versus deliberation as a ease flexibility trade-off, where intuitive responses are sort of fast, automatic, and effortless, so they're sort of cognitively easy, but they're inflexible, whereas deliberation involves paying some cost in order to carefully consider the decision you're facing, take into account all of the sort of relevant details. And so what we're going to talk about this class is using that framework to think about cooperation specifically. When you think about cooperative behavior from this sort of dual process perspective, the question is it the case that cooperation requires rational self-control to override sort of greedy impulses? Or is it the case that we're sort of intuitively predisposed to be cooperative, and then stopping and thinking carefully makes us selfish? And this is a debate that some people like to say, are we inherently good or evil, whatever, some version of this. And people have been arguing about these kinds of things forever. And what we're going to try and do here is use these sort of tools that we have developed in this class so far, come up with a sort of more formal sense of what should the answer to this actually be, like what makes sense here. And so the way that we're going to do it is we are going to we're going to sort of use as the basis the sort of different kinds of games that we have talked about all semester, where on the one hand, sometimes you have social dilemmas like prisoner's dilemma type games where even though cooperation is efficient, there's no payoff maximizing reason to cooperate. It's strictly in your self-interested effect. Affection is the only unique ability, etc. Whereas other times you have interactions that are not just one-off social dilemmas, but they could be repeated games where you interact repeatedly. It could be reputation. It could be signaling. Whatever. It could be just a payoff structure that isn't a social dilemma, but that involves coordination. So here, as we have seen at great length, it can be payoff maximizing to cooperate if the other person is also going to cooperate. And so we're going to think of this kind of cooperation as strategic in the sense that there's a self-interested motive to cooperate. And so if the sort of key idea here is that we so far have thought about just each of these games in isolation. We said, well, if it's a social dilemma, what happens? If it's a coordination game, what happens? And so on. But if you think about life, really, you have lots of different kinds of interactions that you're engaging in. And there's, in some literal sense, basically every time you have a social interaction with someone, it's a new game. You never play literally the exact same game twice. But as a first step in the direction of let's consider the complexity of life where there's multiple kinds of games, let's just say that with probability P, you play a coordination game, and with probability 1 minus P, you play a social dilemma. And so now you're faced with the question of what do you want to do? As we sort of will say in more detail on the next page, this is where the intuition versus deliberation part comes in, where the intuition is easy, but it's not sensitive, so it doesn't get to condition its choice of strategy on which game type it is. Whereas deliberation means you can pay to figure out whether it's a coordination game or a social dilemma and adjust your behavior accordingly. And so sort of to make this as simple as possible, we're going to look at a particular set of payoff matrices that for the prisoner's dilemma, or for the social dilemma, we're just going to consider our normal pay a cost C to give a benefit B to the other prisoner's dilemma. And for the coordination game, we're going to consider something we mentioned this many classes ago, but a sort of extreme version of this where we say, if you think about, like, say, repeated interactions or reputation or something like that as making it so that when one person defects and the other person cooperates, the cooperator doesn't get harmed as much, and the defector doesn't get as much of a benefit. We can just take the limit and just set both of the cost to the person being exploited and the benefit to the person exploiting to 0. And this also is analogous to the average payoff per round in an infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma. Because if you remember, in the infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma, between tit for tat and all D, in the first period, tit for tat cooperates and then switches to defecting for all the subsequent periods. But because it's infinitely long, that first round doesn't matter at all. It's basically just like when tit for tat and all D meet, they just defect the whole time. But whatever. The basic point here is, in this game, if you analyze this, we'll see that DD is the only equilibrium. In this game, CC is an equilibrium because if the other person's cooperating, you'd be better to cooperate than defect. And DD is a sort of weak equilibrium. It's not great. And so overall, it's pretty clearly better to cooperate in this game and to defect in this game. And then deliberation means paying a cost to tailor your choice to which type of game it is, whereas intuition is free and easy, but doesn't get to condition on game type. And so this means that the strategy space for this game, this sort of meta game, where now you're choosing a strategy to say, well, what am I going to do in any given game? It has 4 pieces. First, there's a question of how likely are you to deliberate? So what's the maximum cost that you're willing to pay to deliberate? Because remember, deliberation is costly. And I should say that what we're going to do here is, remember last time when we started talking about just paying a cost to deliberate, in that case it was to be sensitive to state of the environment. We said that the costs of deliberation are things like the time it takes to stop and think, so what you miss out on doing because you're thinking, sort of cognitive effort that you have to exert to figuring out what you should do, and also to sort of rein in your sort of more automatic impulses. You could be using that cognitive effort to do something else. And those costs vary over time. Like, if you're particularly busy and you've got a lot of stuff going on, then it's costly to invest the time to figure out what you should do. Whereas if you're not very busy and you don't really have anything else to do, there's not so much opportunity cost. Or if you're really tired and worn out, then exerting cognitive effort to figure out what's going on is more costly than if you're sort of, well rested and feeling good. And so what we are going to imagine in this model is, in every trial, it's either going to be a one-shot game or a repeated game, and also there's going to be some cost of deliberation that is going to be a sort of randomly sampled. You find out how much is it going to cost you to deliberate on this round. And so this first aspect of a strategy is when you get told, okay, this is how much it's going to cost to deliberate in this period, you have to decide, do I want to pay that cost to deliberate and tailor my strategy, or I want to just go with the intuition? And so you're going to have this threshold T, where if the cost is below that, then you say, okay, I'll deliberate. If it's above that, then you say, okay, it's too hard to deliberate, I don't feel like it, I'm just going to go with my gut response. Then you have, what is your intuitive choice? When you don't think about it, do you cooperate or defect? And then when you deliberate and realize it's a social dilemma, do you cooperate or defect? And when you deliberate and realize it's a coordination game, do you cooperate or defect? So these 4 parameters define an agent strategy. This is now much more complicated than the games we've talked about so far, where an agent strategy was defined just by a single thing, like what's your strategy, cooperate or defect. But now, because you're playing multiple games, you need this sort of whole set of different things to define your strategy. Just to walk you through it, again, the way that it works is in every period of the game, figure out how much is it going to cost to deliberate. And we're going to call this D star, and it's somewhere between 0 and D, where that's just the maximum value of deliberation. And then if it's the case that the cost this period is greater than your deliberation threshold t, then you say, it's too expensive, I don't feel like thinking, I'm just going to go with my intuition. Whereas if this d star is less than or equal to t, then you say, okay, I have enough time and energy to figure it out, so let me think about it and deliberate. Then you have to figure out, is it actually like a one-shot game or a repeated game, a social dilemma or a coordination game? As remember we said, it would be social dilemma with probability 1 minus p, and coordination game, repeated game with probability p. And now the key idea is how you respond is going to depend on whether you deliberated or not. So if you didn't deliberate, if the cost was high, the deliberation cost was high, so you decided to just go with your intuition, then you have to play your sort of intuitive strategy, SI, regardless of whether it's a one-shot game or a repeated game. Whereas if you did pay this cost to deliberate, then you get to tailor your strategy and use your social dilemma strategy if it's a one-shot game, and your coordination game strategy if it's a sort of repeated game or a coordination game. So this is the setup, and we want to know, okay, so within this game, what are the optimal strategies? What are the Nash equilibria? And that's going to tell us something about what we should expect the role of intuition versus deliberation to be in cooperation. Now, we can see, well, what is the intuitive response? And what does deliberation make you do in a given situation? And also, how much are you feeling like deliberating? And so if you analyze this game, obviously it's not a payoff matrix, right? It's a much more complicated payoff function, but you can do a Nash equilibrium in the same sort of way, which is saying, again, a Nash equilibrium is going to be a set of T, SI, S social dilemma, and S coordination, where if you know that the other person has that strategy, it's payoff maximizing for you to also play that strategy. Or put differently, you will always decrease your strategy by switching to something else, right? And so this Nash equilibrium concept is more general than just a payoff matrix. It's just a totally general thing. If you know somebody else is doing that, you can't improve your payoff by switching. And so if you analyze this game, it turns out that there's two possible Nash equilibria. The first one is essentially this always defect strategy. Its intuitive response is to defect, and it just never deliberates. So it says, I don't care what kind of game it is, I don't need you to tell me anything, I'm never going to put any effort to figure it out, I'm just going to defect. And the other equilibrium is what I'm going to call the dual process cooperator. And so this strategy's intuitive response is to cooperate. So the default is to cooperate, and then when it deliberates, what it does depends on the game type. So if it realizes that it's a coordination game, then it sticks with its intuition and keeps cooperating. But if it deliberates and realizes that it's a one-shot game, a social dilemma, then it switches to defecting. And this strategy does deliberate, obviously, and it deliberates when the cost is lower than some critical threshold, C times 1 minus P. And so this strategy has this flavor that when it's in a one-shot game, when it's confronted with a real social dilemma, its intuition is to cooperate, but deliberation is going to make it more selfish. And so this kind of lines up with this intuitively predisposed to cooperate, but sort of rational calculation can undermine that. And now this sort of deliberation threshold of C times 1 minus P tells us some important stuff about what is going on here. And so we're going to dig into that a little more. If you think about, for this strategy that is intuitively cooperative, continues cooperating when deliberation says it's a repeated game, switches to defection when deliberation tells you it's a one-shot game, then you can say, what is the value of deliberation to this strategy? Why is it useful to deliberate? Well, when it's a repeated game or coordination game, sorry that I'm using those words, those terms sort of interchangeably here, but when I say sort of repeated game and coordination game, I mean the same thing, and one-shot game and social dilemma, I mean the same thing. But so the idea is that when it turns out to actually be a coordination game or repeated game, deliberation doesn't do anything, because when you deliberate, you just wind up sticking with your intuition. So that was a sort of, in some sense, that was a waste of effort on deliberating because it didn't affect your behavior. Where deliberation is useful is when it turns out that you're in a one-shot game and you therefore change your strategy. And so with probability 1 minus p, it's a one-shot game. With probability p, it's a repeated game, and so that means with probability 1 minus p, there's actually something useful going on here, because it's a situation where your deliberative response doesn't match your intuitive response. And then you say, okay, so with probability 1 minus p, I do something, and then what good does that do for me? Well, so you're in the prisoner's dilemma, and when you deliberate, you say, oh, I'm going to switch from cooperating to defecting. Cooperating means paying a cost C, defecting means paying nothing. And so that means what deliberation is allowing you to do is it's allowing you to save like C payoff units by not cooperating. And so that means that the expected value of deliberating is 1 minus P, that is the likelihood that you're in a one-shot game, times C, that is the amount of money when you save in one-shot games by switching to defection. And so that's where this C times 1 minus P comes from. This is the expected increase in payoff that you get from deliberating. And so it makes sense that the maximum cost you should be willing to pay to deliberate is the expected benefit you get from deliberating. And sort of what this emphasizes is that for this strategy, the only value of deliberation is its ability to let you sort of miss out or let you avoid sort of wasting money by accidentally defecting when it turns out to actually be a one-shot game. Okay, so now we can sort of look at how this all translates into actual expected outcome. Remember, we said we have two different equilibria. And so now we can ask which equilibrium is risk dominant, and therefore which equilibrium do we expect to actually observe or be favored by selection. And I'm going to show it to you as a function of the B, the sort of benefit created by cooperating, and P, the probability that it's a coordination game, which is going to fix C equals 1 for, And so, so as you go up here, it's more beneficial to get cooperation going, and as you down here, it's mostly social dilemma one-shot games. Down here, it's mostly repeated games. And so if we ask what's the risk dominant equilibrium, it looks like here in this red region. So when cooperation is not that beneficial and games are mostly one-shot games, then it makes sense that you should just defect. That is, if it's always a one-shot game, then definitely you should just be defecting, and there's no need to figure out to sort of pay attention to what's going on. And when it's mostly one-shot games, then it makes sense to just defect and not worry about it. But once you cross this threshold, so there's enough value in being able to get to the cooperative outcome, and it's likely enough that you're going to be in the sort of coordination situation where cooperation is actually payoff maximizing, then this dual process cooperator strategy is winning. And then remember, this always defect strategy never deliberates. So in the red region, there's never any deliberation going on. Whereas in the blue region, it is, but the amount of deliberation, that is this threshold T, that is the maximum cost that agents are willing to pay to deliberate, and therefore the amount that they decide to engage in deliberation is, so this is saying everywhere along this line T is 0.6, along this line it's 0.4, along this line it's 0.2. And so the basic point is just like, as repeated games become more and more common, it's less and less valuable to engage in deliberation, because it's less and less likely that deliberating is going to actually change your choice. And therefore, the less agents tend to deliberate. And so this is sort of saying that, it's again emphasizing and this ease flexibility trade-off, how useful it is to be flexible depends on how varied the either in this case the social environment that you're facing is. Yeah. So, but the kind of point of this is, in a world where there's usually repeated interactions and cooperation is pretty beneficial, this dual process cooperator strategy is winning. And I would argue that it's a good representation of the world that we live in, at least within this, within our sort of society and set of interactions. Usually there's future consequences, and so it's a good idea to be cooperating. To make this a little bit more tangible, I'm going to take a slice across here. That is, I'm going to fix the benefit of cooperation at 4 and just show you how this intuitive response and the deliberative threshold vary. Because remember, so that is, it's always the case that if you were to deliberate and realize it was a one-shot game, you should defect. If you were to deliberate and realize it was a repeated game, you should cooperate. And so then the key question is, what's the intuition and how much are you deliberating? And so you see when it's mostly these one-shot social dilemmas, the intuitive response is to never cooperate, so this yellow 1 down to 0, and the deliberation threshold is also basically down around 0, so we've got this just intuitively defecting and not thinking about it, and then you get this transition at some critical point where the dual process cooperator becomes risk dominant and starts winning, and now the intuition switches to definitely cooperate, and initially, that is, right after this transition, there's a lot of deliberation going on because it's a very mixed world. Like more than half the time, it's turning out to be a situation where actually you should defect. But then as these repeated games where cooperation is good and so deliberation isn't useful become more and more common, you get less and less deliberation going on. And so now the thing that's interesting about this is the implications it has for thinking about behavior in these two different kinds of games. If you think about the fraction of time that agents are cooperating in either the coordination games or the social dilemmas, when you're in this always defect equilibrium, there's just never any defection. Sorry, there's never any cooperation going on. Agents are just always defecting. But then once you get into this transition, it immediately jumps up to when there's a self-interested reason to cooperate, all the agents are always cooperating, which makes perfect sense. But the sort of puzzle in all of this class that we started with in the beginning is, why is it that people cooperate in social dilemmas where there's not this kind of self-interested reason to do it? And the dotted line shows the amount of cooperation in these sort of one-shot settings where there's no self-interested reason. And what you see is that as it becomes more and more likely that you're going to play the games where it's self-interested to cooperate, you get more and more cooperation in the situation where it's not self-interested. And that's because of this kind of heuristic spillover type idea, which is that if the more likely it is that it's a good idea that the more likely it is that it's self-interested to cooperate, the more your default is to cooperate. And so the more likely you wind up that winds up spilling over, and you wind up cooperating even in situations where it's not self-interested to do so. And so this provides a potential explanation for why we get cooperation in one-shot games, which is that people aren't thinking about it, basically. A lot of the time, people are going with their emotional sort of gut responses, which say, oh, you should cooperate, because usually it's a good idea to cooperate. And then that leads them to wind up cooperating even in situations where they shouldn't. And so that's like the basic moral of this, is that from a game theoretic perspective, in terms of this question of should it be intuitively selfish and you need deliberation to do the right thing, or predisposed to be cooperative, it's going to depend on the world that you live in, that is, how likely it is in general that cooperation pays off. But if you're in a sort of world where typically cooperation is payoff maximizing, then it makes sense that your intuitive default should be cooperate. and then you can use deliberation to figure out if it's a sort of atypical situation where you can actually get away with taking advantage of people. And in this setup, we've sort of been using a lot of the reciprocity type conceptual pieces that we talked about earlier, but you can also think about the role of assortment. And so in this plot, I'm going to show you down here, this is the amount of reciprocity, that is the likelihood that it's a repeated game and therefore has a coordination structure. It's a one-shot game, and on this axis, I'm going to show you the level of assortment. And basically, what you see is that as you get more and more assortment, it gets easier and easier for the dual process strategy to win, this sort of cooperative strategy, which makes sense, like we learned in general about how assortment promotes cooperation. So assortment makes it easier to get cooperation off the ground. But once you're in a domain where the dual process cooperator is winning, if you say you start here and you just increase assortment, you see as you get more and more assortment, there's less and less deliberation going on. Because again, what assortment causes is it makes it more and more likely that you're just going to play with someone else that has the same strategy as you, and therefore it sort of is reducing the amount of uncertainty, it's reducing the amount of variation, in this case social variation, and so it's making less and less useful for you to figure out what kind of game it is. So it's again, basically an overriding theme in this sort of intuition versus deliberation thing is the more homogeneous your world is, the less useful it is to be deliberating about what's going on. And so we did this calculation just using the sort of assortment shortcut. With probability A, you play with someone that's the same strategy, and 1 minus A, you play with a randomly picked strategy. But we also can say what happens if you just actually do this on a real cycle. And this is work just recently with Mohsen. Mohsen is here. So now, say imagine we put these agents on a cycle with k neighbors, as we talked about, a few classes ago, and then you see how the evolutionary outcome varies as a function of k. And so this is showing what the intuitive response is as a function of this probability of coordination game for different values of k. And so remember, the higher k is, the closer it is to a well-mixed population, the less assortment there is. So small k means not very many neighbors, lots of clustering, lots of assortment. And so you would see when k is large, so it's basically a well-mixed population, you get a result that looks like the thing that we saw before, which is when it's all one-shot games, you're defecting. When it's all sort of coordination repeated games, the intuition is to cooperate, and it just sort of transitions at some critical juncture. But as you get less than a sort of more and more sparse network, as you get more and more clustering going on, it gets better and better to cooperate. And so you get this sort of transition to the cooperative equilibrium occurring earlier and earlier. And in the limit where you only have one neighbor, even if it's entirely one-shot games, you have basically always a cooperative outcome. And so you can ask, what's the sort of critical value of P at which you get this transition from the defecting equilibrium to the cooperating equilibrium, and the lower K is, that is, the more assortment there is, the easier it is to get that transition occurring. Okay, so this makes this pretty clear theoretical prediction. And just to say it again, the idea is because most interactions are repeated, your intuitive response should be to cooperate. But when you find yourself in situations that are, where there's no future consequences and so you can defect and get away with it, deliberation will make you switch to defecting. But, that is just a prediction, and so we want to actually now say, is there real empirical support for this prediction? And so, again, the prediction would be that in these one-shot situations where there's no self-interested reason to cooperate, deliberating should make you more selfish. But in situations where there is a self-interested motive to cooperate, there deliberation should support cooperation. And so, in order to test this, there's a bunch of different experiments that that people have run. So one example, they always say all of these experiments are of the flavor, you give people real money, they make a choice of whether or not to pay some amount of money in order to give a benefit to one or more others. And in some of these experiments, you have pure cooperation. It's just like a prisoner's dilemma type setup where you make this choice, the other person doesn't get to respond, so that there's no self-interested reason to cooperate. And then there are versions that are strategic where you get to make a cooperation decision, and then the other person gets to respond, such that if the other person is going to also be cooperative, it may pay off maximizing for you to cooperate, but not if not. And then these experiments to look at the role of intuition versus deliberation, they do some experimental manipulation of the extent to which people can deliberate. And there are a bunch of these different manipulations. So one version is you put people under time pressure to make them more intuitive. So you say, you have to make a decision within 10 seconds. And so that just like increases the cost of deliberating because sort of you don't have the time to think about it. Or you say, please stop and carefully consider your decision for at least 10 seconds, which sort of decreases the cost of deliberating because then you don't have anything else to do, so you might as well think about it. There's something called cognitive load, which is you sort of get people to engage in less deliberation by making them engage in like other cognitively demanding tasks at the same time. So for example, a common cognitive load thing is you show a 7-digit number and say, hold this 7-digit number in memory. Okay, now make your decision in the game. Now tell me what the 7-digit number was. And because like a lot of your cycles, in your brain are used up remembering the number, that sort of makes it much more costly to deliberate, and therefore makes people more inclined to just go with their intuitive response. There's also ego depletion, which is basically the same thing, but instead of doing the cognitively demanding task at the same time as your decision, first they make you do the cognitively demanding task beforehand to kind of get you worn out, and then put you into the decision setting. And then there also are just inductions, which kind of just straightforwardly say, please go with your first response in this task, or please carefully consider your response, or whatever. And so there are a lot of these different experiments that people have done. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor, so this is one that we did some time ago. It's just a single public goods game in groups of 4, where each person gets some money. They choose how much to keep for themselves and how much to contribute. All of the contributions are doubled and then split equally. So it's a social dilemma. It's strictly payoff maximizing to just keep everything. And then half the people we say, please decide as quickly as possible. You have to decide in less than 10 seconds. And the other half we say, please carefully consider your decision. You have to stop and think for at least 10 seconds before you decide. And then we did this both with people recruited from all around the world online and with people in the lab, undergrads in the lab at Harvard. And then we want to say, what fraction of the money that people got did they contribute on average in the time pressure condition versus the time delay condition? And what we see on both online and in the lab is that consistent with the predictions about this sort of intuitive cooperation that's undermined by deliberation, because it's a social dilemma, the people in the time pressure conditions contributed significantly more than the people in the time delay condition. And so this is, some support for the theory. There was a problem with these experiments, which is that it's when we told the people decide in less than 10 seconds or stop and think for 10 seconds, but you can't make people do it. And a pretty large percentage of the subjects in these experiments, particularly when we said decide in less than 10 seconds, actually took substantially longer than 10 seconds. And so in our main analysis, we just say, okay, we're going to throw out everyone that didn't obey the time constraint, but that makes the strength of the conclusions weaker. And so there was a recent follow-up to this by some people at Harvard, where they did a big online experiment and they compared, they said decide in less than 15 seconds. They did one where they just let people do whatever they want, or they did one where they make people more deliberative by having them wait for at least 15 seconds. And then they also had them practice with the interface to sort of get the hang of it, which made them faster at responding and meant that basically they didn't have any problem with non-compliance. Like 98% of the people followed the instructions and were able to respond as quickly as they were asked to. And then they also did this interesting addition where they wanted to say they varied whether you were playing with someone that was like, they randomly assigned you to a team, either the Eagles or the Rattlers, and they varied whether you're an Eagle and you were matched with another Eagle, or you were an Eagle and you were matched with a Rattler. And also, they varied whether, and this was in the domain of gains, which is everything we've usually been talking about, so if both people cooperate, you sort of earn more than if both people defect, or if you could think about it in the in the domain of losses, which is to say everyone is going to suffer some loss. If both people cooperate, then both people don't lose as much, whereas if both people defect, they both lose a lot. But if you defect and the other one cooperates, you don't lose anything, and the other person really loses a lot. So that's kind of like actually the original prisoner's dilemma framing about the two prisoners, and they're are you going to tell on the other person or not? That's in the domain of losses, right? It's like no matter what, people are going to be doing badly, but you do even worse if you defect than if both people defect than if they cooperate, and so on. And so they wanted to know. Did the sort of intuitive versus deliberative response differ depending on whether it was in-group, out-group, and whether it was gains versus losses? And so now you're going to show the fraction of people choosing the cooperative option in this prisoner's dilemma as a function of whether it was an in-group or an out-group pairing. And here is going to be gains, here is going to be losses, and for each there's sort of three different sets of bars. For the time pressure people that were more intuitive, the control that could do whatever they wanted, and then the time delay people that were more reflective. And what you see, starting with the gains, is that you do see an in-group, out-group effect. So people cooperate more with in-group members than out-group members, which is a standard thing that we'll talk a lot about in a few lectures. This kind of in-group bias is this big feature of human behavior. But regardless of whether it was in-group or out-group, basically the intuitive condition was higher than the control, and the control was higher than the reflective condition. So this was basically, again, showing that here deliberation or reflection is undermining cooperation. And the same thing was true in the domain of losses, that the more people thought about it, the more selfish they got. So this is sort of another nice piece of evidence in support of the basic predictions of the theory. But a key lesson in psychology these days is that you shouldn't take the results of any one study, or probably even any two studies, that seriously. There's lots of places, opportunities for false positives, false negatives, whatever, mistakes and stuff. And so in general, you want to see, for a question, you want a lot of studies, ideally run by different research groups, and then you do a meta-analysis where you put all of these results together and you say, when considered together, what does the evidence look like? And so the idea is they don't just average the sort of results across all the studies, but they sort of do a weighted average of the effect found in each study, weighted by sort of how precise the estimate was. So a study that has a very precise estimate counts for a lot. A study that has a very sort of vague estimate doesn't count for that much. And so in this meta-analysis, we found 67 studies with a total of 17,000 people, some of which looked at intuition. All of them involved manipulations of intuition versus deliberation. And some of them were in the context of social dilemmas, where the theory predicts deliberation should undermine cooperation, where some of them were strategic, where the theory predicts no effect. And so if we start by looking at the pure cooperation studies, so what you're going to see here is one row for every study, and each row is going to show you the effect size. That is to say, the fraction of cooperation in the more intuitive condition minus the fraction of cooperation in the more deliberative condition. So 0 means there was no effect, there was just as much cooperation in the intuitive as the deliberative condition. Positive numbers means more cooperation when you're being intuitive, which is what the theory predicts, and then negative means more cooperation when you're deliberating. And these studies are just sorted from smallest to largest. And so you can see is each one of these dots corresponds to one study, and the error bars are 95% confidence intervals. And so the point is, remember, this is the 0 mark of no effect. And so there are a lot of studies that show positive effects. There's a few studies that show negative effects, but not significantly different from 0. And there was only 1 out of 50-odd studies that found a negative result. And so when you aggregate all this together and say, what's the overall sort of meta-analytic estimate of this effect of intuition versus deliberation on cooperation and social dilemmas, the result is there is very statistically significant, very statistically significantly more cooperation in the intuitive condition than in the deliberative condition, and it shakes out to about 17% more cooperation in the intuitive condition than in the deliberative condition, which again is what the theory predicts. But an important part of the theory is not saying deliberation always leads you to defect. Deliberation only makes you defect when defection is payoff maximizing. In the context of strategic cooperation settings, where it is actually self-interested to cooperate, then we would expect deliberation to support cooperation. And so there also were a bunch of studies of this flavor where it could be payoff maximizing to cooperate if the other person was also going to cooperate. And so here we have the same one of these plots where you've got the effective, if it points over here, there's more cooperation in the intuitive condition. If it's over here, there's more cooperation in the deliberative condition. And what you see is there are, some studies that are positive, some studies that are negative. Almost all of the studies aren't really different from 0. And when you aggregate them together, it says totally no effect, which again is consistent with the predictions. The idea is that then, just to summarize, in the context of pure cooperation, where it's strictly self-interested or strictly payoff maximizing to defect, there you get more cooperation in the intuitive condition than the deliberative condition. But in the context of strategic cooperation, there's no real difference between the two conditions. And so the sort of, to go back to the beginning slide and all of last lecture, the motivating idea for this is that the intuitive responses are these kind of easy but insensitive, just generalized responses that don't respond as much to the details of the situation. And so you can see that reflected in the sort of overall outcomes in this meta-analysis, in that if you say, what's the average amount of cooperation as a function of whether it's a cooperation that can be self-interested or is not self-interested, and whether they were induced to be more intuitive or more deliberative. And if you start with the strategic cooperation, remember we saw there was no difference between intuitive and deliberative in the last slide. And so here the cooperation levels are around 65%, regardless of whether you're being intuitive or being deliberative. And now the question is, what happens if you change to a situation where there is no self-interested motivation to cooperate? If you take away that self-interested motivation, the idea is the more intuitive, so you should cooperate less, right? Because now there's no motive to do it. And the intuitive people shouldn't be as sensitive to that change compared to the deliberative people. And that's what we see. So for the deliberative people, there's a big drop in cooperation. And for the people who are less able to deliberate, you get less of a decrease. So it fits with this story about intuition just implementing what is generally good, and deliberation, that is what is generally payoff maximizing in the long run, and deliberation allowing you to figure out, well, in this specific situation, what should I be doing? Okay, so that was evidence from a whole bunch of lab experiments. Then there's this really cool experiment run by some Europeans in Geneva, I think. And this is a field experiment. So they set up in this park where there's this long walkway, and you can see when someone starts, if someone starts like walks up there, you know that for sure they're gonna like walk by you, but you can see them coming from pretty far away. And so what they do is the experimenter, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but the experimenter, when they see someone coming, they drop a glove on the ground, like accidentally, and then they turn around and go and start unchaining their bike. And then they want to see, is the person just going to keep walking, or is the person going to stop and say, hey, you dropped your glove, like, you know, let me help you out. That being the sort of cooperative action. And they manipulate the amount of deliberation that this person is going to be able to engage in by either dropping the glove when the other person is like 10 seconds away, or dropping the glove when the person's only 3.5 seconds away. And what they see is the person is substantially more likely to stop and say, hey, you dropped your glove, if they just make a split-second decision, am I going to do it or not, versus if they had 10 seconds to think about it as they were walking up. Even though in the time delay, in the 10-second one, they're much more likely to see that the glove is there because they have all that time to think about it, but still they're less likely to cooperate. Okay, so that's some evidence of this happening in the world. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is that this perspective also gives some insight into why people engage in extreme cooperation or extreme altruism. It's kind of like heroic things like jumping in front of a train to save a stranger, or like running into a burning building to pull a person out. These things typically, they're not done by like this is not like a firefighter running into the building. It's just some random guy saw some guy in the building, ran in and pulled him out. So the question is, why would people engage in these behaviors that are potentially involve the ultimate cost of dying, to help some total stranger? And the suggestions of the theory as well, if you get in the vein of just sort of your default response is to be cooperative, it typically works out well. If you don't stop and think through things carefully, then you're just inclined to help the person. Whereas if you stop and think, you realize, oh man, if I help the person, I might really get killed. I better not do that. And so to test whether there's evidence of this kind of intuitive heroism, we collected interviews given by 51 people that won the Carnegie Hero Award. So this is sort of civilians that risk their lives to save strangers. And we took from these interviews that they gave to newspapers and stuff like that, shortly after they did their heroic deeds, and we extracted the part where they described their decision process. And then we had subjects read those descriptions, not knowing anything else, just reading the description, and saying, are they describing fast, intuitive gut decisions, or sort of calculated, rational decisions? And we also have them controls where they were specifically about intuition and specifically about reflection, so we could see what we could sort of compare the ratings of the heroes to benchmarks that we knew were intuitive or deliberative. And then we had another set of people estimate how long the heroes would have had to act, which I'll mention on the next page. So if you just look at the distribution of ratings of these heroes describing why they did what they did, overwhelmingly they were describing sort of fast, intuitive decisions. And if you compare it, basically it looked exactly the same as control statements that were specifically about intuitive decision making, and radically different from control statements that were about deliberation. And just to give you a flavor, it's things like, I was thankful I was able to act and not think about it, or I just did what I felt like I needed to. And so they were really these things that were very directly, I just acted and I didn't think about it. And that aligns perfectly with this idea of you have some impulse to help, and presumably the people that did stop and think about it didn't act, didn't become heroes, and so we didn't find out about them. Okay, so that's a little bit on intuition, deliberation, and intuition cooperation. And next time, we'll start sort of looking at development and talk about cooperation in non-human primates and kids.